Today will be the start of a video series where we're going to talk about everything Prusa Multimaterial Unit 3. Hello everyone, Chris here. I've been doing a lot of content recently on multi-material setups for your 3D printer. And there's a lot of great options out there that you can choose from, but the one that I have the most experience with is the multi-material unit from Prusa. Now, I've done a lot of videos in the past on the MMU2, and we recently did one on the MMU3 and its advantages over the MMU2. But Prusa sent over an MMU3 unit so we could do a complete walkthrough. I'll show you what you're going to get when you buy it, we'll put one together, as well as get it installed on the printer, and any tips and tricks that I can give you as far as filament management, or even down to slicing files. Now, the MMU3 is currently only available for the 2.5 and Mark III printers. It will be available later for the Mark IV, but this video series is going to be focused on the latest version of the Mark III, the Mark III S Plus. So let's jump right in, see what you're going to get in the box when you buy an MMU3, and then we'll move to putting everything together. We'll go over everything step by step along the way. It's going to be a lot of content, so it will take multiple videos. But hopefully, at the end of this, it's going to help everyone that might be interested in MMU3 or upgrading from the older unit to be even more consistent and just have the newest version and all of its features. So let's get into it. If you're thinking about an MMU3 as we start to open up the box here, I will tell you it is a parts kit. It's just bags of parts that you're going to have to assemble yourself. And there's quite a bit to it. But it also includes your filament management, including spool holders, as well as a buffer. You'll see more of that in later videos. So first off, we have our 3D printing handbook. If you've never flipped through one of these, I suggest you do it. There's a lot of great tips in here, including some tuning and things like that for the filament that's really handy for the MMU. We have some filament. Now, it's important to mention there are two different versions. There's one with the printed parts and then ones you print yourself. This kit is the ones you print yourself. We're going to talk about the printed parts. But this is a 400-gram spool of black PETG, and there should be another one in here for a total of 800 grams. We get some Harbro gold bears. Those are always handy while building. You're going to get a bag with your wires, some PTFE tubes. There's a few things in here that we're going to use during the build. Our couplers. Then you'll get a bag of some printed parts. Now, these are the extruder parts for the Mark III. This is separated out because the kits might be different as we go on to the Mark IV, but these are the Mark III parts. They are printed for you. Then we have a box with the motors. There are 3 motors for the MMU kits. There's one for the pulley, the selector, and the idler. You'll see all that as we assemble it. Then we have a box with our spool holders and the electronics in it. We'll take a look at that here in a moment after we get everything unboxed. As well as the box full of fasteners. And then here in the bottom, we have the buffer plates. These are the plates that help separate the filament so they don't get tangled. It keeps them organized while we print. In our spool holder box, the newest version, they're injection molded. It used to be a vacuum form tray that had some rollers on it. These are much better in my opinion. I think they work better and they connect together. It's much more organized. So you'll get 5 of those kits. We have our electronics, so the board that runs the MMU, our PTFE tubes, zip ties, and a USB cable for flashing any firmware. And then in the fasteners, safety sticker, that's always important. We have some printed parts in here. We're going to talk more about that. But you do get the selector front end here. It tells you which lane you're using, which filament you're using, and it has printed lettering on it. So it's a nice add-on for your MMU3. They do include that, as well as the Bowden connector that goes on the front of the selector. Anything that has a brass insert, a heated insert that's been pressed in, they include that in the kit. Again, we'll go over it. We have all the parts for our buffer, pin, collets, bearings, things like that. You should have a bag with your pulley body parts, as well as the electronic breakout board. This is the power board that plugs into the control board. And then your idler selector parts bag. We've got the probe for detecting the filament, some bearings. We'll see all these parts as we assemble. A whole bunch of screws that we're going to need. and then that other spool of 400 gram PETG. So there's a look at everything you're going to get in the kit. That doesn't include the printed parts. So there's a quick overview of everything in the kit when you don't get the parts included. You can get the printed parts, it's an additional $30, but I'd rather print them myself, and for this video I want to show you any tricks that I know while printing those parts. So we're going to be focused on that now. Now the easiest way to do this is to print them on your Mark III, so make sure you print them before you do any disassembly to your printer if you're ordering that kit. But you can print them on other machines, and I'll show you how to slice them. So all your parts are over here on Printables that you're going to need. We'll go over it, but it does give you some suggestions. A 0.4 nozzle, which is the stock nozzle on most machines, how much filament it's going to take, what material to use, and the layer height. Now the easiest way to print all of your parts would be to use the G-code that they provide for the Mark III. If you have a Mark III, you can just set your printer up, download these, and it's going to give you a tray of parts. Just print all of these out. The only thing that would be different are these two here. This one is for the injection molded spool holders like I showed you. This one's for the vacuum tray, so you don't need both. In this case, we're just printing these out here. Also, you might actually print out some parts if you print these G-codes that you might not use, but you'll have spares. And those would be the ones that have inserts, things like that. Now, we're going to print out our own parts, and here's all the files that you're going to need. We'll go over these as I load them into the slicer, but if you have a bigger machine, it does go a lot faster. If you want to print these on a bigger plate, you can print more parts. So I'm going to print all of mine on my XL. I'm going to swap over to a 0.4 nozzle. I'm going to use PETG, but for my settings, I'm just going to use the 0.2 structural setting. That's the quality setting if you're using a Mark III. Prusa PETG, and then again I will flop this over to a 0.4 nozzle so that I can print these out. I'm going to do 20% infill, and I'm going to use grid. Infill, grid. Now I'm just going to start pulling in parts. You'll get a zip file that has the model parts as well as the G-code files. We want to go through the model parts, and we'll just go through each folder. For the buffer, I'm just going to grab all these and we'll pull them in and we'll talk about them. So really the only thing you need to know is how many of each of these you need. All of that's over on the Printables page, but we can go over it really quick. So most of these you just need one. These are different parts of the buffer. The plate holder, you will need 5, so we can just increase that to 5. The cassette wheel, you're going to need 5 of those as well. And then the cassette segment, this is the inside and outside building the cassette. You actually need 10 of those. It takes 3 complete plates to print all the parts on the XL. So there's a look at everything on the buffer. I'll show you all of the end results here in a moment. We'll just can these. Next one down, if you look at everything that's on the extruder, they've already printed all these parts for you and included them in the kit. But if you were happen to need to print these, here's what they look like. And remember, some of these parts have that brass insert, like the top part here, but these are the extruder parts for the Mark III. The only parts that'll be changing on the printer. The next one down is the MMU3 unit itself. You can see here, these are all the parts that take the longest. I actually like to print out 2 of these PTFE clips, so we'll just increase that to 2, just in case I want to get crazy with the management. But we'll go over what all these parts are. Really the only one you don't need is this one right here, because it has a brass insert. They've included it. And I also forgot about this one. This is the one with the numbers on it that they've already printed out for you. It's been DeskJet printed, so you have color numbers. So we don't have to worry about that one or that one. Just get rid of them with the delete key. And we're going to need 2 brackets here. These are the brackets that hold it on the top of the printer. So we should be good there. And then our last section is for the spool holder. Remember, we have the injection molded one, so INJ. And these are just some guide parts to help guide the filament. They hold the PTFE tube. So you'll need 5 of those, 1 for each spool of filament. And that's all the parts. And here's a look at all the finished plates that I arranged to be able to do all the parts in 3 plates on the XL. just to give you an idea of what all the parts look like laid out. So here's my first plate that has most of the body parts on it. The second plate, I did all 5 wheels and then 5 of the outsides for the cassettes. And then one last plate here for the other 5 of the cassettes. And that's all the parts. Now we print. And we have a whole lot of parts to print, so of course I had to do a time lapse of that. We're going to check that out now. And it would be a good time to go ahead and enjoy some of our gold bears. So I know there's a lot of info here, a lot of it might seem redundant, but I'm trying to give you a well-rounded look of what you're going to get yourself into if you'd like to build one of these, what it might take to print all the parts out, just everything that's involved here. So now we're just going to jump into the build guide, we're going to assemble it, and as we go along I'll try to give you any tips that I might have to make your MMU3 build more successful. So we're going to start here by assembling the idler barrel. This is what selects the filament, it's got bearings on it, we're going to put all that together. Remember, Prusa has a great guide on how to assemble one of these. Follow the guide first, and then come back here if you have any questions or you get stuck. Maybe it'll help after you've watched me assemble it if you're confused on any of the parts. But guide first for sure. There's a lot of great tips in there. Also, they are assuming that you have the tools from your Mark III. Those are the same tools that you will need to build your MMU3. I'm going to use my own tools, but hopefully you save the tools from that kit or you have your own. So we're going to go to the idler selector MMU bag first. We've got a bag with bearings and pins in it. And you have to do these in a certain order because you won't be able to get to certain pins after you put certain bearings in. So we want to start with the center one here. And then we'll have one of our pins. These are 9x5x15 pins, or shafts if you'd like to call them that. But from this side, we'll slide it in. And then you can use your 2.5mm Allen wrench hex key to push it in with. And just make sure it's seated enough inside that plastic part so that it doesn't obstruct this hole here because another bearing will have to go in there. And then we can go ahead and put in the next one. We have another shaft. And then the outer one. Then we can flip it over. We'll do the inside one here. And then the outside one. After that, we will have one of these same bearings. We'll go in the end. And we'll just make sure that's nice and flush. You can kind of press it against the table. It should go in there relatively easily. Now we can put the grub screws, these are inside your fastener bag, inside the coupler. This is what holds the selector barrel onto the motor end, but we can go ahead and put those in loosely. It's a 2mm wrench. We've got one on both sides. I just put them in enough so they're not quite into the center of the coupler because we do have to put this on the motor shaft. We've got this one and then one on the opposite side. Then we'll take 4 of our M3x10mm screws and we'll attach our coupler onto our idler, but it does have to go a certain way. So there's a flat section to your idler barrel here. You want the grub screw pointing at this last pin, this bearing right here. You want one of those grubs pointing at it. So it would align just like this. And then those M3x10s will screw into the plastic part. I like to install them all, just to make sure they're all lined up. Before I snug them down, we'll go ahead and complete that. Just remember, this is a plastic part. Don't get carried away with tightening these up. The coupler's on. Now's a great time to make sure all your screws are tight. You know where the grub screws are, they're in the right location, and all of your bearings are turning freely. We're in good shape. Now we can move to the idler body parts. This is actually where the barrel goes into. And we'll need our idler motor. This is the one with the standard shaft on it. The other two have longer shafts or screws on them. And you noticed in that idler selector bag, there were some of these little rubber buttons. These actually help more than you think, but they install right here in this hole on the door. You kind of have to spin them a little bit to get them to seat. But this is so the idler will strike that button, and it really improves the accuracy of centerless homing for that driver to be able to contact this button rather than hitting a hard surface. This is actually a big improvement over the other model. It doesn't seem like much, but it really does work. So don't forget that. And then our idler will seat in just like this. It can just set in there, but we want to make sure on this side there is as little gap as possible. You can see all these compartments here. That's where it allows those bearings to roll from one side to the other, but the gap inside here needs to be very small. Hopefully no gap at all, basically. But when that's in there, you can use one of your leftover pins. It goes in from the side, and it'll slide into the idler itself. And that's what the idler will rotate on. And to keep that pin from backing out, you can use one of your M3x10s in this hole here, just to block its path. Then we'll install some square nuts, one on the motor end right here. This holds the electronics cover on. Be careful, they can get away from you. But one on this side, and then one over here on this side as well. Then we can install our motor into our coupler. It is important where the wire runs because we're going to route that later. But we'll let the wire face up. And we want the flat spot of the motor facing up as well. You can see that there. And then we just need to make sure that the flat part of the shaft is aligned with one of the grub screws. Remember, this is self-homing. It will know where home is every time it starts up, but it just has to be aligned with one of them. So we'll slide it in on this side since this is the one we can see. If your grub screws are positioned correctly, it should slide in fairly easily. It'll fit into that printed part. Again, remember, we need our idler to be as far this way as it can be. We want to make sure that idler can turn freely. And it can. It has to get all the way over to this position to be able to home. So we're good there. And then to put the motor on, we've got more M3x10s. We've got two up here, one there, and one over here. And then we've got two on the back side. They go down inside here. Sometimes those can be kind of tricky, but use your wrench to kind of guide them in. But one will slide down here. Before you put these last two in, make sure that your square nut is still in there. Put one there, and then one over here. And the motor's on and in place. Once you have all the screws in, then you can go back and do the final tighten. You just want to make sure they're a little loose when you put them on so that everything lines up correctly. And don't forget about the grub screws. We should already have it lined up with the shaft. You can see that one there is lined up with the shaft. That'll just make sure that it's on tight. But we want to push it over to this side. Again, we don't want any gap. And then we can tighten up one of the grub screws. I like to start with the one that's on the flat part of the motor shaft. And then we can spin it and tighten up the other one. And now our idler assembly is complete. We can move on. So the idler is complete. We'll go ahead and move on to the selector. This is the part where from the back of the MMU, it runs through, it's pulled in, and then it issues it through this selector so that you have a sensor here to tell if the filament has ran out. Also, it works as a cutter, so it can put a new tip on the filament if it's not loading correctly. So a pretty crucial piece. So for this, we'll need our magnet and then one of the ball bearings it comes with. Now the first thing you want to do is make sure that the ball bearing you're using is magnetic. So this one is. Not all of them are, so double, triple check that, especially if you're using parts from another kit. They're not all ferrous material. So that magnet has to grab onto this ball to hold some tension so that the sensor can work more efficiently. So the magnet goes in the slot right here on the side. We'll just push that in, and then you can just go ahead and drop the ball in so it keeps that magnet in place. You should be able to see that ball in the window. So filament comes from the back. That ball rides on the filament when it's present. So it's got it close to the sensor up here on top. When the filament isn't present, the magnet draws the ball down, ensuring that it's far enough away from the sensor so it's not triggered any longer. That's just how that works. Then we'll grab our selector motor. We'll pull off the nut because we can install it on the selector. We'll use one of our longer screws. This is an M3x30. And we'll install a hex nut right underneath that magnet. So I just put it on the longer screw, and that'll help me press it in here in the body, just like that. You can back this out. Then on the cutter side, there's a slot here for another square nut. We'll slide that in. And then with those two installed, we can go ahead and put on our motor nut, or trapezoidal nut. So make sure that magnet is flush, and it'll go on just like this. And that'll take M3 by 10 millimeter screws. Just two of them is more than enough. One there and one there. And then from there we'll install our brass bushings. These actually go on smooth rods so the selector can go from side to side. I like to install them from this side. So one here and one on this side. But if you have to, from this direction, you can use the tabletop or something to help press them in. Sometimes it's just a little challenging to get them in that printed part. Might take a little convincing, but you should be able to get both of those flush. Then we'll spin it, and we need to put two square nuts in these slots here, so that'll hold the front cover on. One here and one here. Can use your 2 millimeter wrench. I think that one's the easiest one to seat these if you need to. Make sure they're seated from the front there. You can see them. And then we can put our coupler piece on. This is one of the printed parts that came with the kit because it has that brass insert, that heated insert. It should be in the same bag as that front display with the numbers on it. That one there, set that aside. But this is the part we're looking for. And it does only go on one way. You want the flat side on the same side as the nut. You can tell because that brass insert fits over the center hole where the filament path is. Then you can put that on with two M3x10s. Then we can move on to installing our Fenda probe, the filament sensor. Looks a whole lot like a bed probe, but in this case we're just using it to detect filament with that ball. But it attaches here on top. We'll need another square nut to slide in right here. And then you can slide in your Fenda. And you can see it in that window. Rough adjustment, you actually want it level, the sensor level with that window right about there. But we're going to adjust it after everything gets assembled. So just set it in there for now. And then you can use your M3x10 to snug it up just so it doesn't fall out. So we'll put it right there. And we'll adjust that later. And then we can install our blades. This part, be very careful. Those blades are very sharp, but they go back here. And there's a square nut here on top. Let's go ahead and put that in. Your blades are in these little plastic packs so they don't get away from you. And then there's a cover that holds the blades on. So the blades will set on here in a V formation. One there. And then one on the other side. Make sure they're not overlapping. And then you can put that cover on. It has a part up here on top that kind of gives you an idea of how far it goes down, the depth. It'll just kind of set on top of that part, just like that. And then you can put another M3x10 through the cover to hold the blades down. And you want this one pretty tight. You don't want those blades moving around when it tries to cut that filament if it should have to. But again, they are printed parts. Don't get too carried away. It's going to be raised up just a bit. You can see there's a gap because it's trying to smash down on those blades. That's not a big deal. But again, just make sure they're not overlapping. And you should be okay. The selector's done. Now we'll start working on the body. First up, we'll start loading the bearings. We have one over here on this side for the door. The top is going to hinge on this. And then we have one on the other side for that door. You should just press in, no problem at all. Make sure they're flush. And then we have one here for the drive gears. There's a shaft that holds all the drive gears for the different filaments. It spins on this one down inside here. I have to angle it a bit, but it'll fit right in. And then there's a section that actually goes on the pulley body front. This is where all the filament passes through. The selector goes up and down this to select the different filaments. We need 4 square nuts right in here for that. One there, there, and there. You can make sure those are all seated. And then there's some PTFE2 pieces that go in these holes to help guide it. There should be a bag with pulley body pieces in it. That's where they are. And on those tubes, one side is going to have a chamfer, the other side is going to be flat. You want that chamfer facing out. So you put them in just like this. And just give it a push and make sure they're seated all the way. But make sure that chamfer is out on all 5 of these. These are actually kind of a clear tube. It makes it a lot easier to tell what side that chamfer's on. All of those are seated. Then your printed part will slide over that. They should go right on those tubes. And then it's going to have 4 M3x10s here to fasten it. And we'll snug all those up. There we go. Then we can flip around to the back. We have a holder here that holds the incoming filament tubes. It looks like this. And there's some collets that go on here to clip that filament on with. So it has an arrow on one side. The collet will go on the other side. So the arrow is facing this way. Collet goes on this side. They should just press into that part very easily. But we'll put all 5 of those on, just like that. And then it installs on the body. So on the body side, again, we're going to take one of our M3x30s, the longer screw, and a couple of hex nuts. Just put it on the screw a thread or 2, and then you can flip it over, and we'll install them inside the body. Just give it a little press. It should seat relatively easily. And then we'll do one on the other side. And that's what we'll hold our PTFE holder on. That arrow should face towards the front of the body, so it goes on just like that. And 2 M3x10s. So we're good from the back side. Now we can start working on the pulley motor. The pulley motor should have the longer shaft. It's got a flat section to install all those gears that actually pull the filament. But we're going to load them on like this with the gear teeth, that side facing the motor. So we'll just load them on one at a time. You might have to back that set screw out a bit if it's not fitting correctly. But we'll just slide all 5 on, and then we can line them up when we get it in the body. I like to snug that set screw up just a little bit so it keeps it on the flat side of the shaft. See, if you screw it down just a little bit, it'll keep it from spinning, because you always want that set screw on the flat portion. All 5 of those are on. And then we'll jump back to the body. We have to install a square nut before we put the motor on. It's just easier to step through these installs one square nut at a time, because if you put them all in, you'll probably lose them as you're turning the parts around. We'll just make sure that's seated, because the motor is going to cover that up. You want the wire on the motor to go out the back, because that's how it's going to route to the board. We'll just slide it in, and the end of that is going to go into that bearing that we installed. So we'll slide it in like this, and we'll seat the shaft into that bearing right here. And then you can push the motor onto the part and then start to spread these gears out a bit. And a pro tip while you're doing this, put the flat spot on the shaft facing up, because that will put all the grub screws facing up. Since they're sticking out a little bit still, it's not going to have enough clearance if you get these in sideways, so try to put it in just like this. And that will give you a little bit more clearance for moving those gears around. That'll enable you to slide them down to the spots that they need to go in. You can just kind of get them ballpark for now, and we'll line them up. So that's where they should be, roughly. And then we can go ahead and fasten the motor. So on this side, there's an M3x10 that goes here. And there's a couple more, so I just get these started and then do the rest, so it'll line the motor up. There's one. And then there's a couple more on the back side. One in each of these slots. And then one over on that side. Check to make sure that square nut that you put in there is still in there before you put all these in. Now that you have them all lined up, you can go ahead and snug those up. So the motor's on. Now we can line up all these gears. The best way to do it is with a piece of filament. Grab something that's nice and straight, preferably easy to see, depending on what color your filament is that you printed your MMU3 out of. We'll just grab this red here, but we'll just slide it in through the channel, and that's going to tell us where that gear needs to be lined up. It needs to be exactly in the center of that channel. And then we'll use our 1.5mm wrench here to make sure it's in the center of that filament. And we'll snug that up and then move on to the next one. If the filament's bent or really bent, it can skew your results. Make sure it's as straight as it can be. Having these centered as much as possible on that filament is one of the best tips that I can give you to make sure your MMU unit is consistent. So double, triple check this, or if you're having issues, come back to this and check it again. And there we go. All 5 are nice and straight and snug. Now we can start working on the selector motor. This is the one with the 4-start screw. But again, we've got some square nuts to put on before we mount that motor. So on this side, where the motor will mount, we'll put a square nut here and here. And then we'll make sure our selector is somewhat in place down here on the other side, because our motor is going to go in, but it's going to thread inside that screw on the side of the selector, or nut on the side of the selector. And we'll install our smooth rods. The selector actually moves on these as the motor moves it. So one there in top. They'll be flush with the side of the printed part here with the body. And then one here on the bottom. Again, make sure it's flush. Make sure that selector can move freely before we put that motor on, which it can. And then your motor wires will be facing up for routing purposes. You can just set it in there and start threading in that screw. And kind of force it all the way to the side. Watch your wires, but force it all the way to the side there. And you can thread it on, and that'll bring it into the body, just like that. Make sure your motor is flush seated, and then you can put M3x10s in these 3 holes to fasten the motor. Again, make sure all 3 of those are seated before you snug them up. With your kit, you should get the ball-ended style wrenches. They're pretty much a necessity for this build because some of them you have to kind of get at an angle. But hopefully you still have those from your printer build or kit. And our selector motor is on. So just to make sure that your selector moves freely and as it should, I suggest you push it all the way down here and then just back out these trapezoidal nut screws on the side of the selector. Just loosen them up just a bit. You don't want to back them out because they can be really hard to get back in. But with those loose, just pull the selector down all the way so it turns that rod. Just take it all the way to one side and then back to the other. So if there's any movement that needs to be done, if that nut needs to move around a bit, it can. But this is going to ensure that there's no problems going forward, and then you can just go ahead and snug up both those screws again. Again, ball-ended wrenches. It's going to be about the only way you can get in there. So just an added step to help keep things consistent. And then when you have that nut tightened up again, make sure you can still move it successfully. So we're good there. And we're starting to get everything together here. You can go ahead and place your door section that we built. So it just goes down over the top. And then there's some of these extra shafts like we used before on the barrel. One goes in this side here. Kind of hard to see, but it goes right in there. And it pushes into that bearing that we installed in the body. You can use your wrench, again, to seat it. And then one on the other side for the other hinge over here. And those are kept in place to keep that pin from sliding out with some M3x10s. Just in the hole above, it just threads into the plastic. You can put those in. You'll have one of those on each side. Make sure you can successfully lift the door. There's no hanging. And then with that door open, we've got some more square nuts. We have one right here. And that's to put the tensioner screw for the door in. And the other one should have already been seated before we installed the motor, but it's on that side. Then you can go ahead and close it. Don't tilt it or you're going to lose that square nut. Just go ahead and close it for now. And then we have some M3x30s, two of those, and there should be two extruder style screws to put tension on that door. So two of these. And they just go on those M3x30s. One in this side. And you can just put those on flush with the top of the door for now. We'll go through adjusting those later as well, but that'll keep the door in place. So we're good there. Now we can move to our control board cover. That's this part right here. It has spots here on the back for M3 hex nuts. We'll just kind of press them in. It's very shallow. You should be able to do that with your fingernails. You could pull them through with a screw if you really wanted to, but they should just slide right in, like so. And then our control board goes in here. You can flip it over. There's actually buttons on the control board that slide in there, and it'll slide on just like this. And then there should be some M3x6s, a little shorter screw to attach that. And there'll be three of them, same spots. We put those nuts in on the other side. And we'll fasten those. And while we're here, we can go ahead and fasten our PD board. That should be in a little bubble wrapper, but it's another PCB. This is what solves some of the power issues that this module can have. It also converts it over to the new style cable for the new printers. But this is what it looks like. And it just slides down in these two ports right here. This is power and connection for the printer. But again, it fixes any issues we might have had in the past. And then in your kit, you'll have a cable that's consolidated to one plug for all your data and your power together. Much easier to use. And it'll just clip right in here. And you can put your sleeving on just to keep everything nice and neat. Once your sleeve is on, it is actually much easier to plug in all of the motors and everything before you put the board on because they're kind of down underneath. So we'll plug all those in. There should only be 4 connections, 3 motors, 1 sensor. The fenda will go right here. Next to that is the pulley motor. This one here. Next to that is the selector motor here up front. And then finally that idler motor on the other side. Once it's all plugged in, it makes it much easier just to flip it up here on top. And then you can use 2 M3x18s, a little longer screw, to hold it on each side here. And the control board's all set. So the next thing we need to be worried about is cable management. It is pretty important. You want to make sure none of the wires are in the way of the filament path. The selector can wear this wire out, so you want to make sure it's situated a certain way. But I think that's a great stopping point for this video. So we got a lot done in this video, but there's definitely more to do. We're almost complete with the MMU3 assembly, but we do have to move on to installing the buffer and putting all the parts on the printer that make it compatible with the MMU3. But my intention for this series is to give you an idea of what you're going to get yourself into if you buy one of these kits, as well as all the parts that you will have to print to put this whole thing together. And it will give you some tips on making your MMU3 as consistent as possible so you don't have any of those pesky interventions when you're trying to create awesome 3D prints. So that will be it for today. More videos to come, and I'll see you really soon on the next one.